The Via Stoica Podcast with Brendan and Benny. Powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires. Welcome to the Via Stoica Podcast. My name is Benny. I'm going to be your host for today. And today we have a very special guest in this Stoic conversation. Eric Weiner has joined us. He's an author, a journalist, a New York Times bestseller, a philosopher, and a man of many talents. We're so lucky to have him here today. And we're going to talk about his career accomplishments and especially some specific books that relate to Stoicism and philosophy in general. So for some people who are unfamiliar with your career, Eric, could you give us a little bit of a backstory? It says you worked for NPR, which is interesting. Can you give us the rise of Eric Weiner?
Okay, I'm going to go back a little ways, but stay with me to when I was 5 years old, growing up in suburban Baltimore, and I decided to run away from home. And I actually went through with my threat, like most kids don't, and I got like a mile or two from my house before the police picked me up. But I mention that because it sort of began a pattern throughout my life, which is always seeking something around the next corner, whether it's happiness, creativity, or whatever. And I thought the best way, so I had this severe case of wanderlust, and I really wanted to see the world. But, I had a pretty useless degree in English literature, no money. And I thought the best way to do it was as a foreign correspondent. And that became my career goal. And at age 29, I achieved it when NPR, who I'd been working for in DC, Washington, DC for a couple of years, dispatched me to India to open their New Delhi bureau. And that's what I did for the next 10 or so years. Out of New Delhi, out of Tokyo, out of Jerusalem. And it was gratifying in a lot of ways. It was exciting. It was, I suppose, prestigious in certain quarters. And the problem was I had almost the perfect job, but I did not have the perfect job. It was the life of a foreign correspondent was beginning to wear me down. I was already prone to mild depression. And what do journalists do? They report on sort of the worst of humanity, to be honest. Things that go wrong, people that are shot and Midtown Manhattan or countries at war, whatever it is. And this started to bother me. And I went to my boss, the foreign editor, and I said, look, I want to take a year off from my assignment and just travel around looking at the happiest places in the world and what we can learn from them. And I recall he said something along the lines of, what have you been smoking? And this was before smoking such things was perfectly legal in most states. So that's when I decided to approach a publisher with my proposal, and they went for it. And I wrote The Geography of Bliss, one Grump's search for the happiest places in the world. As you said, it became a New York Times bestseller and now a docuseries featuring Rainn Wilson of The Office fame. He played Dwight essentially as me, and that's airing on NBC Peacock. And I realized I just enjoyed writing these books more than I did reporting the news. And I've written 4 more since, and we can talk about what I like about that, but I now have what I consider the perfect job, not the almost perfect job.
Oh, thank you for highlighting that story. And it's such a wonderful journey to see how you chose yourself to go from journalism, where you write about the worst things that you see, and then go to more positive things. You want to see the best things in the world and find yourself as a writer to writing more books. That's such a wonderful a transition to see. And I loved, I found your work through the Socrates Express. I really enjoyed that. It's kind of more like a travel log style, and and now it makes more sense, right? Hearing your background as a correspondent and then exploring all those wonderful places. And I also love like audiobooks, and I really enjoy that you read them yourself. It gives your work a lot of really different feel. You do really well with that, and you're reading it yourself.
Thanks. I mean, it is pleasurable to read them too. I mean, it's hard work, but I don't feel like a book is done until I've narrated the audiobook. And then I'm like, okay, now I know how it sounds. So anyway, yeah, I'm a huge fan of audiobooks also.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, about having the audiobook to really complete the cycle. On that note, we do have a friend, I don't know if you're familiar with Donald J. Robertson. He wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor.
He's a Stoic superstar. Rock star.
Oh yeah, he is. He absolutely is one of the leading figures in Stoicism at the moment. And he says like he tells us like he writes while imagining how the audiobook will sound. Do you think that way too when you're writing?
Absolutely. I run some writing workshops as well, and I always tell my students, read your work aloud. You don't know because you think about it, humans, we've been listening to stories for what, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years. We've been reading stories for maybe 8,000 years, depending on how you mark the beginning of the written word. So I think it's just much more deeply ingrained in us, this oral tradition. And so I think this is partly from my training at NPR is I learned how to write for the ear, and I always read what I've read out loud, and that's when I catch things or realize that sentence goes on too long or whatever it is. Absolutely good advice.
So yeah, good stuff. So you're talking about your book. You talked about the geography of Bliss that puts you on the map.
So to speak. Yes.
Yeah, so to
Right.
speak. Yeah, yeah, that puts you on the map, and no pun
Okay.
intended. I'll take credit for it. And then the Socrates Express, and now Ben and Me, which I'm reading and I'm really enjoying. But let's zoom into the Socrates Express first. Why did you pick these specific philosophers? And is traveling to their space to their places an important part of your writing?
Okay. Lots of questions there. First of all, I'll back up a little and talk about why I chose philosophy in general. Is I was, I had dabbled in various religions and wrote about that. And, I was severely middle aged at this point, and I was casting about for wisdom, and if you think about it, where do we find wisdom? Well, religion has been and is still is for many people a big source of religion, but it's not for everyone. And social science has sort of filled in the void with authors like Malcolm Gladwell and psychology and pop psychology. Everyone loves a good study. Just go to a cocktail party and say, a study found that, and it doesn't matter what you say next, people will believe what you say. So that's another source of wisdom. And I found neither particularly satisfying, but philosophy, diving into the books and the writers, I realized that, that very basically philosophy comes from the Greek word, of course, philosophia, which means love of wisdom. And so that's how philosophy began, with this love of wisdom, not of arcane subjects or logical positivism or all the other, more modern trends in philosophy. And this was the philosophy that interested me, the philosophy that was practical, that was useful, that was accessible. So yeah, so then I set about to come up with a list of philosophers, each one answering a different how to question, like how to wonder, how to cope, how to see, how to listen, all kinds of very basic how to questions. And so I looked for philosophers that, number one, could answer that question in a way that I found accessible and meaningful. And secondly, of course, yes, I did want some geographic diversity because I am at heart a traveling philosopher and I have to go to these places, and I'll get to that. So I wanted geographic diversity, not just all of them in Western Europe or the US or wherever. And I did want sort of intellectual diversity too, which meant including three women philosophers, including Eastern philosophers like Gandhi and Confucius, and then also just, just people who spoke to me and also would take me to an interesting place. It was as much my gut as my
Yeah, thank you for that. And as someone who travels a lot myself, I can really respect that, and I can really, the diversity and the inclusion of the entire world scene is important to show all different sides. And the Socrates Express really resonated deeply with me on that level, and especially because traveling has such a great inspiration for reflection. As Seneca once wrote, he said, "You wonder why your travels do you no good, why you're saddled with the very thing that you're trying to get away from." And I wanted to ask to you, why is travel so important to you? And you've mentioned, the wanderlust, which I love, and I've looked at myself as a sort of, diagnosing myself with this escapism as well. Then I'm trying to work with that. That does that include with your travel as well? And how do you fit that all in?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, escapism is underrated. It gets a bad rap, oh, you're running away from your problems. Well, yeah, okay. Why not run away from bad stuff as long as you're simultaneously running toward something, I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson went off to the South Pacific, to get away from his problems. So I think escapism has its place in our lives. But I think my philosophy of travel really is best summed up by a quote from the American writer Henry Miller. He said, "One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things." And I love that. And I think that's absolutely true. Now, it does not apply to every trip and all travelers. You can go to a Club Med in the Caribbean and not acquire a new way of looking at things at all. You acquire a suntan and a hangover, and maybe that's it. So it really depends on the attitude you bring to the journey. There are no boring places, only boring travelers, I like to say. And so that's the appeal to travel for me, is broadening your horizons. I know that sounds cliched, but really it means, I'll put it this way, like oftentimes if you've only say you were born in the US, you've only lived in the US, you've never traveled anywhere, you're going to reach assumptions about things. You're going to think that this is the way it is, when in fact, that is only the way it is in your place at this time. In other places, that's not how it is. In other cultures, that's not how it is. So to me, travel is about expanding the universe of possibilities for your life, I would say.
Yeah, perspectives change reality, right? And that's one of the things that I honestly agree with. That traveling and just I love how you said that to be it doesn't the place, it doesn't change, it changes your perspective, it changes who you are. I loved how you said that, and that's so important for someone who travels as well. Change your perspective and to widen your glance to see what's happening, right? To see different cultures, to learn about what they do. Yeah, and since this is the Via Stoica podcast, and we wanted to kind of move towards your book, The Socrates Express, I see that I have the sense that there's a strong Stoic feeling, right, to it. You talk about, you start with obviously the title, and you start with Socrates, right, the godfather, the grandfather of Stoicism, if you will. And you have Epictetus and also Michel de Montaigne, who's heavily influenced by the Stoics. Is that something intentional, or how did that come about?
Well, perhaps you know the expression, to a man with a hammer, the whole world looks like nails. So you're a Stoic podcast. I think a Buddhist might read my book and say, well, there's a heavy Buddhist flavor to the thread throughout the book. But I think you're right, because I think that the basic Stoic philosophy, Stoic wisdom about, controlling not external events, but your internal reactions to them, that is surprisingly universal. And you'll see that particularly, say, in Buddhism. The more I studied Buddhism, and I have studied the overlap with Stoicism just hits you in the face. The Buddha was essentially saying the same thing, and roughly at the same time, by the way, and not that far off as the Stoics. I think Buddha and Socrates were pretty close to being contemporaries. And yeah, so I don't know if Michel de Montaigne was influenced by the Stoics. He read them, or he reached the same conclusion by different means. Aldous Huxley wrote this wonderful little book called The Perennial Philosophy. It's lots of quotes and his interjections, but it's basically arguing that throughout the ages, all the religions, all the philosophical traditions are basically saying the same thing in different ways. And I think it holds true for Stoicism, even when it comes to the Epicureans, who on the face of it it always amuses me how among modern Stoics and modern Epicureans, there's kind of tussle back and forth. I don't know if they're that different, those philosophies. So I think Stoicism is just naturally infused into many different streams of thought.
Yeah, as I've read your book, and I followed you from Austria to Japan, and I see, obviously this is, as you mentioned, a Stoic podcast, and we do look at things through a Stoic lens. Um, but I saw you weaving Stoic philosophy, the Buddhist, and other traditions together. And as you've traveled, through the West, the East, and the Middle East, from Oman to Baghdad, that must have been quite an adventure. But I wanted to see, what are the similarities do you see in their philosophies and in their way of lives?
It's a good question. Sort of conventional wisdom is partly true here, that Western philosophy is more linear, and we're getting into history here, but I think, pre-Christianity, there was only philosophy, right? And then along comes Christianity, and Christianity becomes the philosophy for the West. And philosophy as we know it becomes relegated to what they was known as the scholastic school in the Middle Ages. And they tried to sort of just protect their turf of what they could argue about and debate and discuss and think about. And in the East, they never really had that split between religion and philosophy. In fact, if you pick up a book on Asian philosophy, it's going to look an awful lot like a book on Asian religions. And I know in universities they'll have separate Asian philosophy professors and Asian religion professors. I don't know how they make that distinction because, if you go to some place like India or China, they're often fused, philosophy and religion. But we're all human, and so I think this need for meaning and purpose in our life is universal. And I just think that science, as wonderful it is, just can't answer what I call the three basic questions of life, which are: where did we come from? What happens when we die? And what should we do in the meantime? And, science just cannot answer those. And I don't think it ever will. Science is very good at explaining the means, the mechanism of, if you break your leg, as I did when I was 17, of how new bone cells are formed and the broken pieces are fused and your leg heals. It can very expertly describe the physiology of the how, but not the why. Like, why does your leg heal? And this is where philosophy and religion, I'll put them together here for the sake of this argument, where they play a huge role in our lives. They can.
Yeah, those why questions are very important, right? Like, why did you break your leg, and why does this happen? I really love that, and as you go into the Socrates Express, you really focus on the how-to questions, and you go from a wide variety of philosophers. You go from Gandhi, who you said you have a personal connection with, to Montaigne, the same kind of you have a connection there
I,
as well,
I do.
and to
Yeah.
Nietzsche. And you wrote all about all of these figures that you wrote about, all of these different philosophers that you've highlighted, and I wanted to see who of these or which of these
Oh,
philosophers do
boy.
you identify most with.
Okay. You're asking me to choose my favorite child. I only have one daughter, so that's easy. Well, you just actually, maybe by coincidence or not, you just mentioned the two I think that I found most relatable: Gandhi and Montaigne. Gandhi, who I'm very familiar with and was before I wrote this book, and Michel de Montaigne, because I just found him to be like myself in that he was a 16th century French, well, essayist, but he invented the essay, really. An essay in French is essayer, which means to try. So he had a successful career as a mayor and a politician, and he retired to the countryside near Bordeaux, and he goes up into this tower and he buys a bunch of books. He has 1,000 books. You can still see it today. And he starts to just ask questions about life, everything from the nature of your thumb to what happens when you die. And the way he just sort of wrestled with these questions in a very open way and not in a particularly academic way, and I mean that as a compliment, I found that relatable. And I should say that that's how I approach these philosophers and these philosophies. I didn't think of myself as writing about Gandhi or about Montaigne or about Thoreau. I thought of myself as encountering them, as having a relationship with them and wrestling with their ideas, which is different, I think, from the sort of more authoritative academic voice, which is you sort of, I'm going to pick them apart and I'm going to write about them. I was engaging with them.
Yeah, so you have such a wide range of different philosophers, the one that we've mentioned already, and before we go over to your new book, Ben and Me, we wanted to look at the Stoic side as well. And you chose Epictetus, right? A wise choice. He's obviously the teacher of Stoicism, especially in his day, with the three names that we know best now. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and kind of to look at Marcus Aurelius, probably known as one of the best practitioners, at least from what we can see from how he lived his life. What are your thoughts and what are your views on Marcus Aurelius?
Who doesn't love Marcus? I mean, but everyone loves him. I mean, emperor, philosopher, but he came later, of course, and he's not a teacher per se. He's more like in Montaigne's category, I think. He's an essayist. He's wrestling with these questions on the page. Epictetus in his handbook and other works, I find that he's like, here are the basics, He's like elementary school, junior high school, not that, to diminish his ideas, but, making it as simple and easy for people to understand as possible. And, Seneca is more like the grad student, and Marcus Aurelius is the professional out in the world, actually trying to put these into practice while running the biggest empire in history. Yeah, they each play a different role. But if you want to get to the basics of Stoicism, I think that Epictetus makes sense. Can I turn the tables for a second and ask you guys a question? So, I write about 14 philosopher and philosophies, but there's one these days that is just particularly hot, in certain circles and even in the mainstream world. And that sounds strange to say a philosophy can be hot, but that is, of course, Stoicism. So, why do you think that of all the philosophies, ancient and modern, Stoicism is currently the one that is the most popular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's we get asked that a lot, right? Why Stoic philosophy is now so popular, and what I ask myself is it really Stoic philosophy that is so popular, or is it some kind of different movement that people taking it from it, right? Especially, we mentioned in the book, you mentioned a lot about community and doing the right thing and becoming the best version of yourself, and that's really what Stoicism is about. And for example, I loved one of the examples that you have, and with about Rob Coulter, who talks about his kid being ill. Right, I think that was on a Stoic camp, and he said, that was very difficult to him, but I had to then show up as the best version of myself, as the best father, the best husband, and to be there in that moment. That's my responsibility then. But then when we look at people like Jordan Peterson, who give you like, these are the 12 rules, and this is what you've got to cling on to and hold on to, that's not really the Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy goes way deeper than that. It really goes into the who you are, why are you doing what you're doing, and how can you become better, instead of just clinging on to those rules and those, the kind of what we see in the broicism world right now.
Right. I mean, but of course, I agree with you, but of course, Stoicism is not static. It wasn't in ancient Greece and it's not today. And I agree, the world does seem more out of control, but it's probably always been out of control. And of course, there are all kinds of religious and other philosophies people could turn to during tough times, and they do. But maybe it's the simplicity of Stoicism, and maybe the emphasis on character. Like Marcus Aurelius can be very tough sometimes, saying, basically stop crying and just go do something, and I think, you know, and this sort of segues to my book about Ben Franklin, but this idea of virtue and character, these are terms that seem just well, yeah, they seem almost silly to us today. Or to talk about being virtuous, it implies that, you think you're better than other people. It smacks of just something very distasteful. But in Ben Franklin's time in the 18th century, and certainly earlier, virtue and character, these were not controversial. There was no virtue signaling. That this concept is very recent. They wouldn't know what it meant. They'd be like, well, of course you want to be virtuous, and of course you want to have character. So I think part of Stoicism's appeal is this return to something foundational, and something simple. Simple doesn't mean easy, though, right? Stoicism is hard. And I think actually the hardness of Stoicism is another appeal. It's not a philosophy that coddles you. And I think people, and perhaps especially men, and especially young men, don't want to be coddled. They want to be challenged. And Stoicism sort of challenges you to turn inward, turn inward for your emotional sustenance, but still be very engaged in the world. I mean, it's not Buddhism, at least in some schools of Buddhism, where you retreat from the world into the forest or into a cave. The Stoic is always engaged in the world and yet turning inward at the same time. So I'm just thinking out loud here. Maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for that answer as well. I think that's really important to know as well. As you said, these philosophies evolve, why it's happening and where it's going through. And it is, as you mentioned, Stoic philosophy is simple in its essence, but it's difficult in its execution. That's what it appeals to me as well. And it is difficult for many people, including for me, but that's also good. And before we go over to Ben and me, in the Socrates Express, you also showed a different side of Epicurus, right? Many people see Epicurus and Epicureanism as this pleasure-seeking philosophy, but it's far deeper than that. And I love how you looked at it as someone who values simple living, right, and the absence of pain, and beyond that, the minimizing of discomfort.
And to maximize the amount of pleasure out of, for instance, a very simple meal. So, I think that the Epicureans are misunderstood, I think, more than even most philosophers. That, Epicurus was not about these indulgent meals. He was like, with the right attitude, even a piece of bread and a piece of cheese can feel like a feast. So it's about cultivating that attitude of gratitude and appreciation and heightening your sensory receptivity to the simple pleasures in life. So, in fact, like Epicurus and Epicureanism, as I understand it was sort of the opposite of, when you describe someone as an Epicurean today, it means, oh, they're into gourmet food. And that's not what Epicurus was into at all. I mean, as I write in the book, all philosophers are misunderstood, but some are misunderstood more than others. And Epicurus is at the top of that ladder.
No, thank you for writing that first of all, and also for changing that perspective or giving us a different perspective on someone like Epicurus and what the philosophy was really about. Because a lot of people, they just hear one thing and that's what they stick with and regurgitate and think that that's what your book does lovely here. And beyond that, the Socrates Express, we couldn't skip over it without talking about Socrates. And obviously, we mentioned a little bit that Socrates was the grandfather of Stoicism and maybe the grandfather of Stoic philosophy in general. And we have the Socratic method where he's always talking about questions, and your book have all the how-to questions as well. But what is the talk us a little bit more about the importance of asking questions?
Yeah, the importance of a fully conscious ignorance. That you know what you don't know, and you know that you don't know. It's not gobbledygook. It's sort of like it's stepping back and saying, wait, how much of my life is a series of is something I do because I know things to be true, and how much of my life is based on assumptions. And once you start to interrogate these assumptions, you discover that a lot of them are flimsy and based on nothing other than lazy habit or received wisdom from YouTube or wherever. And so Socrates, the OG, as you say, is really challenging us to question everything, and but not in this sort of way that Monty Python likes to poke fun at, philosophy is this sort of useless profession. Quick aside is Steve Martin, the comedian, was a philosophy major in college, and he has this great line. He says, usually if you major in something in college, if it's geology or biology or physics, you forget all those facts like the minute you graduate. He said, but if you major in philosophy, you'll retain just enough to screw you up for the rest of your life. There's that image of the philosopher who's just tangling himself in logical knots. And that's not what Socrates was about. He was about, I want to know what beauty is. I want to know what courage is so I can appreciate beauty, so I can be courageous. So there's still a practical aim to it. I don't think Socrates was a metaphysician, really. I think he was more concerned with practical wisdom and how to be courageous, how to appreciate beauty, etc. So, but it all comes down to asking those questions. And I think it's helpful in life when you're looking at a problem, whatever it is, to stop and you're wrestling with the same questions over and over, to stop and ask yourself, what questions are we not asking here? Just what are we not asking? And that's Socrates.
Yeah, it's a different philosophy what we have right now and what they were doing back in the day. And before we, as kind of a segue into Ben and Me, and I love these books where you have all this combination of different philosophies together because it widens your perspective. It shows you different ways of looking at life. And before leaving the book, I wanted to just highlight one philosopher that you mentioned that really struck a chord with me, and it was Simone Weil. And she mentioned, well, as you mentioned in the book, that attention is love. And that really opened my eyes to so many different things. And it made me actually walk around the street paying more attention to what's happening around me and seeing the world better in a different view, and also to the people around me. And that has made me feel more connected to those around me. But as we go over to Ben and Me, where you write about Benjamin Franklin, and it looks to me that you really paid a lot of attention to Benjamin Franklin and to his life, to his philosophy. But I wanted to start with, what are the lessons from Franklin's life that stood out the most for you?
Okay, good question. So now here I'm diving deeper into one historical character, and he's not a foreigner like Nietzsche or Confucius or Gandhi or Socrates. So I'm wrestling with sort of my own heritage as an American. which was tricky, to be honest. And we all have this cartoonish image of Benjamin Franklin in our mind. Basically, it comes down to two things: the kite experiment and the womanizing, both of which are basically true, more or less. But he was much more than this cartoonish, roly-poly, sort of the founding father you most want to have a beer with. He was all that, but he also was a philosopher in his own right, and a natural philosopher, as they called them then, which was a scientist essentially, but also a very practical philosopher of life. He had absolutely no interest in metaphysics. He said all religious and philosophical debates can boil down to this formula: it is so, it is not so, it is so, it is not so. And he had no patience for that. He wanted to know what was practical about it. So, a couple of things from Franklin in terms of life lessons. One is the importance of habit. And here I think he does join hands with the Stoics. So he's in his early 20s, and he's a nobody, and he's broke, and he's living in Philadelphia, and he's been through some drama already in his life. He's run away from home, etc. And he sits down and he decides to get his stuff together. And so he comes up with this plan of how to achieve what he called moral perfection. I thought, wow, moral perfection. Like, talk about setting the bar high. And he comes up with a list of 13 virtues that he thinks are important. Well, actually, it's a list of 12 at first. Everything from temperance, which was number one. He figured if you're not sober, you can't forget about the others. And industry and cleanliness and honesty, even chastity, which is kind of amusing. And a Quaker friend of his looks at it and says, well, Ben, that's a good list, but you can be kind of arrogant. Maybe you should add humility to the list. So he's like, oh, yeah. So he had 13. And then he comes up with this plan he takes a notebook and he writes a grid, and he decides he's going to focus on one virtue for 4 weeks, and 4 times 13 happens to equal 52. So it works out to a year. And he's going to carry this notebook around with him. And every time he strays from, say, the virtue of honesty or the virtue of cleanliness or whatever it is, he's going to make a little X mark. And he thought it would be easy. He said, I know, like most people, I know right from wrong. I know what it means to be a good person. This should be easy. It was not easy. And soon his notebook was filled up with so many black marks, and the paper was torn. It became a different kind of holy book, he said, and he had to switch to pencil. So on the one hand, the experiment was a failure. On the other hand, he says like the calligraphers who practice and model themselves after the masters, he had bettered his hand. And I like that phrase. He had bettered his hand. And so he was very much about having a method and having a habit and having a plan. He thought, we know we should be thinner. We know we should be kinder. We know we should be more compassionate and all these things. That's not really in question. It's the how do you go about it? So that's one area where I think he was extremely helpful, and is extremely helpful today. I've got others if you want to hear them. Another one is the virtue of changing your mind. Now, as we get older, most of us become more set in our ways. Perhaps, you might know someone like that, where just older they get, the more like, this is the way it is. Ben Franklin was the opposite. As he got older, he became more intellectually nimble. And not about small things either, but about big things. He became an American rebel at age 69. He's editing and signing the Declaration of Independence at age 70. He's representing the U.S. in France in the 70s, and he's changing his mind about issues like democracy and slavery. He did enslave 7 people as a younger and middle-aged man. But in his 60s, 70s, and 80s, he lived until 84, he evolved and became, in fact, an ardent abolitionist. And I find that just helpful. Like today, when politically we're so divided, everyone is set in their ways. And it's seen as sort of a character flaw if you change your mind. If you're a politician and you say, well, I used to believe this, but now I believe that. They're like, oh, you flip-flopped. But, Franklin would say, when presented with new evidence, new experience, he was very much experiential that way, I've reached a new conclusion. And he didn't see it as a character flaw, quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's an important thing to have, right? Especially, I like that being nimble and being able to change your mind, especially as we get older. And even in general, it's something that we don't really like being told we're wrong. But when you have like people around you, examples, for example, someone like Daniel Kahneman mentioned it somewhere where he at one point changed his mind, and that's something that people love to do. And even Socrates said that maybe the loser of a dialogue, of a conversation, actually wins because he's the one that gets to learn something new. But it is difficult right now for us to see how people kind of really quickly change around, and especially in politics when the changes, when they flip flop so instantly.
Right, when it seems to be expedient and not based on new experience, but just political expediency. And I mean, confirmation bias is probably like the biggest threat to democracy and life as we know it. The news media is struggling with this. I mean, just this idea that once you decide X is a certain way, then you see you see confirmation of that everywhere. And those confirmations are not wrong. There is that evidence, but you're just blocking out all contrary evidence because it's uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable to hold two competing ideas in your head at the same time. It's cognitive dissonance, and we kind of try to run away from that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And just about I'm from the Netherlands, and when I look at American history, it's there's so much going on there. And I wanted to see, why did you target Benjamin Franklin? Right, there's so many of the founding fathers, and there's so many other people out there as well. And he seems to be connected with all these establishments like the Illuminati and all of these things. But you really point out in the book to Ben's humanity, right? He used to own slaves, but he changed. And we are all humans; we all make mistakes. But I wanted to see, like, how did you become so interested, and how did Benjamin Franklin become your topic for this deep
Um,
research?
well, first of all, a fun fact for Benny is that Franklin visited the Netherlands, one of the places he traveled to. And, so look, Franklin is he's the least dead of the founding fathers. He's the most relevant today. I can't really picture like, Washington or Jefferson or Adams with a work typing away on a laptop, but I could totally picture Ben, as I call him, in a cafe in New York or San Francisco with a MacBook Air Pro and noise canceling headphones. And if the noise canceling headphones didn't exist, he'd probably invent them. And so he was, number one, is he was open to technology in a way the other founders were not. And that's why people like Elon Musk has said that Ben Franklin is his hero. We can get into the question of whether Ben Franklin would see Elon Musk as his hero. I just, in fact, answered one question on X. Someone asked me that question is, I think that Elon Musk is the modern day Ben Franklin. What do you think? And my short answer was technologically, yes, politically, no. That's the brief answer. So the fact that Elon Musk looks to Franklin as his hero says something about both men, actually. And also, he was working class. He was what they called a leather apron man back then. They didn't call them blue collar because they wore, if you were a printer or a candle maker, you wore a leather apron in the shop. And he was a leather apron man, came from a poor background, grew up in Boston, while, Jefferson and Washington were landed gentry, basically, and grew up in large estates. So he was relatable that way. He was also, kind of ironically, even though he was on the one hand, the most down to earth of the founders, he was also the most international and cosmopolitan. He traveled to the Netherlands and to what is today Germany, and lived in France for 8 years, lived in London for 17 years, went to Canada. So he combines all these, and he also, in his autobiography, which he never finished, by the way, he's kind of open about, I made mistakes. He's got this self-deprecating sense of humor that none of the other founders have. And I value humor, especially self-deprecating humor. So he's able to poke fun at himself. Plus, he was also just fun. I mean, he did love Madeira wine, and he loved women, and he loved to play chess, and all these things that made him fully human. And for that reason, I was drawn to him. I never considered any of the other founders. I would not want to write about them.
Yeah, that's nice to know that Benjamin also went to the Netherlands and to Germany. Like it's 17 years in London. That's pretty wild life. And as from the Netherlands, I look at American politics and I see it like more of like a soap opera, but with far bigger implications than a soap opera. But as you talk about Benjamin Franklin, and you mentioned that he's the only president that ever became president.
That's
He
right.
also has his money on his face on the money,
That's
right?
right.
And when you
I
look
think
in the
that can
Socrates
you go
Express, you
ahead.
say something similar to Gandhi, right? You say never became president, but he does have his money on his face on the money there. And I wanted to see if you see that there's some kind of a link, right? Because both of them were big for the societal change. They were pivotal and focal men in that moment. Do you see a deeper connection between them?
Wow. I never thought about relating the two other than they are the face of the currency, which is always a mixed blessing, by the way. Benjamin Franklin, little aside here, he was a capitalist, but he wasn't as capitalistic as you would think with his face on the $100 bill. He never applied for any patents for any of his many inventions, lightning rod, etc. And he figured, as he said, I have benefited from the inventions of others, so why shouldn't they benefit from mine? And that, I think, is the commonality between Franklin and Gandhi, this notion of usefulness. This was Franklin's North Star. Is it useful? How can I be useful? Not in a Mother Teresa way, but in a practical and a fun way. He saw it as like a challenge. For instance, he invented the matching grant. He's coming up with trying to raise money for the first hospital in Pennsylvania, first real hospital in the colonies. And he comes up with this idea of a matching grant. And he took great, you can see him smiling when he says, basically, he went to the assembly of Pennsylvania and said, if I raise $2,000, will you match it? And they said, sure, you'll never raise that, they're thinking. And he did. And he said he basically tricked them into being more generous versions of themselves. And for Gandhi and his practice of satyagraha or nonviolent resistance, it was not, people think it was just religiously based. He just thought you shouldn't hurt people. Yes, but also he thought it was useful. He thought it was effective. He thought nonviolent protest is the most effective way to enact change. So both men had this fixation on usefulness and effectiveness to the exclusion of the sort of metaphysical discussions that lots of philosophers and religious people can get lost in very easily.
Yeah, and the two men, like Gandhi was there at the, he was obviously non-violent, but he was still resisting, and he had to resist, and the same with Franklin. He was there at the big change of everything.
Right. I think there's a word for it, which is courage. Nonviolent resistance takes courage. In a way, it takes more courage than violently resisting. Like his soul force is what satyagraha means. People engaging in nonviolent resistance have to be very disciplined because your natural instinct is to lash out when you're being beaten by police officers, for instance. They have to be disciplined and they have to just accept the pain without striking back. And that takes courage. And in Franklin's case, at age 69, he's a good generation older than the other founders. The relations between the colonies and Britain are deteriorating rapidly. And he decides to jump and become a rebel after being a loyal British subject for 69 years. And he had more to lose and less to gain than the young whippersnappers like John Adams or James Madison, who was 20 years old. It's easy to be a young rebel. It's harder to be an old rebel. It takes courage. And, that's not, it's a word like character and virtue that it's hard to use today without sounding corny. But I think that is the appeal of Stoicism and a lot of these philosophies is like, okay, virtue, character, courage, let's reclaim these words, which have become controversial, which have either been watered down or just, we keep them at a distance because it sounds holier than thou. No, these are, these are attributes that everyone should aim for.
Yeah, and that's also our task, that's our to define them and to make these words like courage our own. Courage isn't just doing something that's scary or risky. It's knowing that it's the right thing to do and doing it even when it's scary or when it goes against your personal desires or wants.
Right.
And as you talked about these different philosophers in the Socrates Express, you really compare them, and now you go over to Benjamin Franklin. How would you describe Benjamin Franklin's philosophy of life and his way of looking at that?
I think, you're familiar with the philosophy of pragmatism, which actually was fully developed a century after Franklin passed away by people like William James and others. I think it was a form of early pragmatism. So William James famously said, and I actually love this, it's very short, truth is what works. Truth is what works. And, when I tell that to people, they're like, oh, you can't just say 2 plus 2 equals 5 because it works for you. Like, that's not what William James is talking about. He's like, let's say, Benny, that you wanted to get in shape. You feel like you maybe need to lose a few pounds, not that you do, or and you need to be in shape. And you could say, well, someone could say you should take up running. You're like, well, does it work? I got to read about this. I've got to, look at the studies. And then there's someone else, let's say Bryce also wants to get in shape, assuming he needs to. And someone says you should take up running and he just starts running. Right. And who is going to benefit more? Bryce will benefit more, even though he may not believe the studies or know about the studies about the connection between exercise and health, but it's true for him because truth is what works. And that was truth is what works. And it's not mercenary, and it's not this notion of alternative facts. It's what works. Religion, for example. Franklin was not a conventionally religious man, but he had many friends who were preachers. And he thought, if religion and these inspire people to do good in the world, then it's useful and I'm all for it. So yeah, that was his philosophy.
So yeah, that's a good. It's about doing it, right? It's about just going out there. The same with the philosophy, and you've got to, obviously they say to study, but you've just got to do it, and that's all about just moving forward, right? Just going and moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And because I was just, okay, just to get personal, but not that we haven't been personal. Like I'm between projects and I've been a bit stuck. It's holidays are coming up. The weather's turned dark and dreary here in the northeast of the US. And there's always this kind of, when you finish a book, as I just did with Ben and Me, there's kind of a postpartum depression that takes over authors. And so I've been in a funk, I would say. And today I decided, you know what, I'm just going to do stuff. It might be chores and errands. It might be just checking off, simple things, compiling my expenses, things like that, rearranging furniture, whatever. And I found this has helped me today, for instance. Before I came on to talk with you guys, I just started getting stuff done, not writing books and having deep philosophical, but just everyday stuff. And action begets action. And so, it's inertia. Body at rest will remain at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. And that outside force, I sort of dawned on me this morning, does not have to be the big idea. It can be, I got to pick up the dry cleaning. I've got to change the cat litter. I've got to reply to a bunch of emails. And that just kind of creates this momentum. There's that saying that if you have a task that needs to be done and there are two people in your office sitting around and one is sitting around doing nothing, the other is running around busy, give the task to the busy person. It's more likely to get done because action begets action.
Yeah, and I also wanted to look at Benjamin Franklin's historical significance. As we said, part of the founding fathers. Without him, the U.S. would likely have not won the Revolutionary War. He shaped the Constitution the way he did, right? And we have other people like Jefferson, Adams, and Washington, right? And obviously he's right there in the mix. And sometimes he's kind of seen as on the fringes.
Yeah, but he played a different role from those men. I mean, Washington was the general, okay, who's fighting the British. But Franklin's over there in France, seducing the French, so to speak, into coughing up aid in terms of money and men and equipment so that Washington can fight the war. And the French were very reluctant at first. They did not want to get involved, but he worked his charm. He used a lot of empathy. He could, empathize with them. And I think without Franklin's diplomatic skills in France, I don't know what country we'd be in now, but it wouldn't be the United States of America. And when it came to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, he was not the main person drafting either, but he was the editor and the facilitator. And at the Constitutional Convention, it's, in Philadelphia in 1787, and everyone is stuck and they just can't, they're just at loggerheads. They cannot agree and it's hot and it looks like this thing's going to fail. It's not going to come together. Country won't come together. And then Franklin does something totally out of character. He says, well, I think we should begin each session with a prayer. And people are like, what are you talking about? You're like the least religious person here. And they discuss it, they take a break. It doesn't pass the motion, but he paused the rancor for a moment. And that was useful to pause it. And they got back to work and they resolved their issues. So that's the kind of supporting role he played in fact, all of American history.
Yeah, as we start to wrap this wonderful
Okay.
conversation up, and really want to be mindful for your time here, but I just wanted to know, you spoke about this book and all the other philosophers, but what was one thing that really surprised you about writing this, doing the research about Benjamin Franklin, and what stood out to you from this process of researching on Benjamin Franklin?
The Ben Franklin effect, I would say, was something that surprised me. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I did because of you. I did because of your book.
That doesn't count. That doesn't count. So this is, Franklin's a young man in Philadelphia. He's working as clerk, a kind of lowly job at the Pennsylvania Assembly. And there's one new member, very rich, powerful guy, just doesn't like Ben. And Ben senses he's going to make life miserable for him. Now, what does he do? Now, most of us would suck up to this guy and praise him and be nice to him. Instead, Franklin asks him to do him, Ben Franklin, a favor. I heard you have this rare and beautiful book. Can I borrow it for a few days? The man says, sure. Franklin borrows it, reads it, returns it with a nice note, and they got along swimmingly. And Franklin's conclusion is the way to endear yourself to someone is not to do favors for them, but to induce them to do favors for you. And there have been studies on this in recent decades that show that, in fact, it is true, that we like people not who are nice to us, but who give us an opportunity to be nice to them. The Ben Franklin effect. And that was one quirk of human nature that he stumbled across that did surprise me. And his socialist leanings, almost socialist, which we could get into. But let's just say that if you really looked at his feelings about money and economics, he'd probably be bumped down to the $20 bill.
I love that the Franklin effect, right? That having someone do something nice to you. I think that that's something that I'm gonna definitely look into. And as for my final question here, it's as a fellow traveler who's lived abroad, lived in Spain, lived in other places as well, and I love to see, when you talk about these things like Montaigne, I love to go to the castle there as well and visit those places throughout your journey, and when you write about these books, you've gone from being a journalist to a writer. That was a big journey, and covering all those different philosophies. I wanted to know, how has that changed your philosophy of life and your outlook and your encounters with all these different philosophy, with all these different cultures and different people and minds. How has that helped you from where you are right now after you've written this book and you said you're kind of in a bit of a funk, and now you're saying, okay, let's get back into the action mode. How has that changed you and your outlook in life?
Right. No, it's a good question. So, I mean, I would like to tell you that, I write these books about wisdom and about wise, brilliant people like Ben Franklin and Socrates, and it's changed my life 100%. And this is not true because it doesn't work that way. My wife says I'm wiser on the page than I am in real life. And I think that's true for a lot of writers. You put your best on the page and you're writing in a way aspirationally, like you're writing about the way things should be or could be. And then you get back to work and your life and the problems you have, and you forget that. And often I will say, I just don't know what to do in this situation. My wife will say, Socrates Express, page 237, Ben and Me, page 112. You wrote it. I'm like, oh, yeah. So, having said all that, there are a few things that have stuck with me. One, as we were talking about, is that idea of usefulness. And as I get older, I start to think about that more and more. Not how can I stroke my ego some more, write another best-selling book, get more followers on X or whatever. But when presented with a request to speak or to do something, like, is it useful? What would be useful in this situation? I think that's one thing from the Franklin book that has stuck with me. From Socrates Express, there's so much, but I think this idea of altering your perspective, and that's a little bit Socrates there saying, question everything. It's a little bit of Stoicism. I believe Epictetus said, and I'm paraphrasing here, with the right perspective, a crowd in rush hour can be a party, essentially, by changing your perspective. Henry David Thoreau, who we haven't talked about, but brilliant also, would even look at Walden Pond in Massachusetts upside down between his legs, to change his perspective. So when presented with a problem, with a setback, instead of saying, how can I fix it? I will ask myself, how can I look at it differently? That brings us right back to Henry Miller. One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things. So that's travel at its best, and that's philosophy at its best.
So as we start to round things up, and thank you for all your answers and your time, but I was looking at my notes and I forgot to mention that we should probably call you doctor right now, isn't it? You had an honorary doctorate degree by university in Bulgaria. There it is.
That that is my honorary doctor honoris causis. I have an honorary doctorate from the second most prestigious university in all of Bulgaria, Veliko Trnovo. Um, I was on a flight the other day, and they did. It's true. I was flying to Rome, and they said, "We have a medical emergency. Is there a doctor on board?" Press the call button, and I was sorry. Press the call button. Then there was some asshole cardiologist in business class. I'm like, all right, I'll let him have this one. But next time,
Oh, that's
it's
fantastic.
Dr. Weiner.
That's hilarious. That's fantastic. And thanks for sharing that story. But as we wrap things up now, and we wanted to show people where they can find you. So tell us, where can they find you? If they're looking for more information, where can they go?
Always best up to support your local bookstore. Other than that, there is a large corporation that will send you books quickly in the mail. You can learn about me at ericweinerbooks.com, all one word. And quick plug for writing workshops I lead to Bhutan in the Himalayas. I have another one coming up in late April, early May. It's no writing experience required. You see the country, do some journaling. And I know the country well at this point. It's an amazing place. This is the land of gross national happiness. And so you can find out at my website or at HimalayanWritersWorkshop.com. So, and I'm on the usual places, X and Instagram and all these other places.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Eric. We really appreciate you for being here, and definitely check him out. Check out all the, get the books, check out the Himalayan walks, and thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, this was fun. Okay. Take care. Happy travel.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.